Pia, I'm going to start. I'm going to introduce you briefly. You can also say some things about you later on after I finish, but that way we can start on time and we get anybody that joins will join a little bit in process. But good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the GEO MBON webinar. Today we have Ms. Pia Wiche. She's from Chile, but she works for UN Environment. And she's going to talk about the processes that are necessary to define and incorporate new indicators in governments to address Agenda 2030. And so she's going to talk to us about challenges of creating and using indicators for decision making in public policy. So Pia, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Frank, and thanks a lot everyone at MBON for having me here. It's a great pleasure to share some of the things that I've been learning throughout the past few years with our focal points on environmental indicators in the governments. Well, as Frank said, I'm a consultant for UN Environment. I'm an expert in environmental indicators. And through UN Environment, what I do is coordinate the project South-South cooperation and capacity building on environmental indicators. So this is exactly what I do. This project has been dedicated to the creation, the adoption, and the production of a core set of indicators in the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean for the past 2 years or so. I am based in Chile, but I work with the Panama office, with the ROLAC office of UN Environment, with someone called Francesco Gaetani. If you were here for the previous session of the MBON webinar, you would have seen his presentation. And with him, we work with the 33 countries of the region. So this is a large set of governments that we work with, and our focal points are on the ministries of environment and on the statistical offices. What Frank told me that asked me to talk about is what is the process that the governments and the official organizations use to put together a new indicator, and I will be sharing some of that with you. I will also focus on the process that we as UN Environment have followed with the countries, which is very similar to the process that they have. And just a little voice of warning here. I would like to make a difference between the nationally produced indicators, which is what I will be talking about mostly, and the centrally, you could say, produced indicators, which are those indicators produced by, let's say, international organizations that use databases or satellite images and that are not necessarily an official report of the countries. So that being said, we can start with the presentation. Let me open this. Oh, sorry. There you go. Well, producing indicators is always a story of finite resources. You have always little time because the central government or whomever wants this indicator soon, like let's say the SDGs, for instance. It's also a finite resource is talent, because governments, differently from academia, where you would normally, once you get tenure in a university, you would usually stay in that university until you retire. But in the government, talent is a much more mobile resource. People will come and go. Normally, they will last for a few years, and some of them will make a career in the government. But depending on the structure of each government, you can get a very, very high rotation. And this is the case, for instance, in the Caribbean countries, where people will go into government and then find a job at an international organization, and normally, unfortunately, leave the country after that. So you have very little talent, or you have talent with very little experience. And also there's the always finite resource, and I'm sure that you will agree with me, is the budget. So you get very small teams that are normally overworked, that have limited talent, and that have a limited budget to answer normally to a very, very high proportion of requirements from the central government and international organizations, for instance, like the UN, that request environmental indicators or any type of indicators. And we have limited resources, but we have many, many concerns. So we got economic growth, right? We got how much money we're spending on science. We got social issues. We got corruption indicators. We got sustainability indicators. There's all sorts of things going on in the world, and all of them in the world that we live today are normally tracked with a number, and this number is usually an indicator. So how do we account for progress or retreat in those very many topics, right? Sorry about that. We have, well, we have three ways to do that. We have variables. You know this already, right? Variables, which are phenomena that are studied and which value in time varies, right? We have data, that is a set of numeric values, which are observed, recorded, or estimated. And we have the indicators, and the indicators are statistics with the capacity to show a relevant phenomenon. So it's not just any statistic, it's the one that can show this relevant phenomenon. And you get to an indicator normally from processing statistical series by aggregation, proportion, growth rates, etc. And you use it to show the state, evolution, and trends of a phenomenon. So the first thing that happens here, and I will already start relating to what Frank and I were talking about a few weeks ago, is that when wanting to create these numbers to track all of these many issues that are going on in a country, the statistical teams in the ministries and the statistical offices, they are very clear about the difference between these three words, and they're sort of let's say touchy, if you want, on how other people use it. So here's the first tip for creating indicators. Like, make sure that what you're creating is an indicator and, for instance, not an index. There's like the subtle differences between one and the other, but it's important vocabulary to have when discussing this with the public sector. As I said before, we have this story of finite resources, where you have only a handful of statisticians in governments, and you have many issues. And in fact, you have thousands of indicators out there that already exist. And here I'm just putting a few initiatives. We got the Montreal Protocol with all of the indicators related to the use of ozone-depleting substances. We got Sustainable Development Goals with 232 very complex indicators. The Convention on Biological Diversity with another pretty big set of indicators. The Caribbean Environment Program, and this is like a sub-regional program, right, that has a long list of indicators, CITES, etc. So how do you navigate this, right? How do you focus the energy of your government teams on the things that are actually most pressing for the country? And here is where our work comes in. We, through in UN Environment, we work with the Forum of Ministers of Environment, and this is the forum that gathers all of the ministers of environment for Latin America and the Caribbean. And this forum, many years ago, like in 2002 or so, they created something called the Latin American and Caribbean Initiative for Sustainable Development. And I will continue to refer to this initiative as ILAC, okay? So you could think of ILAC like the small SDGs, but much earlier, that were born much earlier than them. And it's an initiative that has 7 priority areas on different topics. So they have protection and restoration of ecosystems and their biological diversity, right? The management of water resources, climate change, economic issues, social issues, vulnerability related to disasters, so on, and governance and institutional arrangements. So you see, this is a very broad subset of topics, but they are all covered by the Ministries of Environment. Then again, going back to the limited resources. So we have a huge universe of things that can be measured. Then we have like these subsets, which are the initiatives that gather together like a subset of these issues. But we have one more limited resource we haven't talked about yet, and that is the decision maker. Decision makers only have so much time to understand what is happening and make the changes that are necessary to make things better. And this is their job, right? To make decisions so that people's lives are better. And on the other hand, statisticians only have so much time to gather, process, and analyze data and produce indicators. So I'm just trying to make you, give you a little bit of a view of what has been and what is actually the situation in most of the countries of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm sure that this is something that is also valid for any other country that has small statistical teams, even countries that we would think are developed. Let's think about, let's say, okay, something that has a lot of statistics. Let's say the US. Even the teams in the US, the statistical teams, are very small compared to the government, the size of the government. And that's a place where you get a lot of talent. So this is always a story of limited talent. And what happens when you have many commitments and little resources is that you end up not providing information. What's happening here, the graph that you're seeing is a summary of the first 15 years of the ILAC. This was done back in 2016, I believe. 2015, it was a few years back. And what we did here was measuring how much each of the 50 indicators of the time had been reported by the countries in the first 15 years of the initiative. And if everyone had reported every indicator, what you should see is a very colorful circle. But we see a lot of white, and this means that most of the countries were not reporting on the indicator. So out of 50 indicators, you get, let's say, something around 12 indicators that were reported by some of the countries, and no indicators were reported by all of the countries. Even simple indicators, now that we are speaking about biodiversity and nature and so on, even simple indicators such as the forest cover, and that is the largest bar that you have, that's indicator 1111, the large green bar that you see. Even that indicator, forest cover, that is centrally produced, right? That we actually have the data for the entire world. Not all the governments are able to access this information. And maybe they're not accessing it because they don't know it is there. And maybe they're not doing it because they can't, because of their internal processes. So when the ministers came up with the new ILAC, these 7 priority areas were created in 2015, right? 2016. They decided, okay, let's stop this nonsense. We can't have this huge amount of indicators that we're not reporting on. So let's just have a set of multi-purpose indicators that align to our initiative as well as to other initiatives. And that way we can report on the things that are important for our region, and as well, and at the same time, report for the things that are important for the rest of the world, and make better use of the time for statisticians, which is not a lot. And there we started a very long process, and I am not intending to read this slide, it's just to give you an idea of how long it is, of developing environmental indicators that would be multi-purpose. We could either develop them or we could bring in indicators that were already in use in other initiatives to fit into this ILAC initiative. This huge process that you see on your screen, I have summarized in these few boxes. So normally in the government, when you want to make an indicator, because an indicator is a very expensive thing to produce, you need not only people to gather and process the data and produce the indicator, you also need infrastructure to do this. You have to be very picky on what you are measuring, because this is public funds, right? You can just use them for anything. So the first step is to identify priorities, either for the country or the regional or other territories that you're considering. So you could have the national level or regional level or perhaps global level. And an example of this are the priorities in the Caribbean. So from many topics, from 86 topics that were covered in the ILAC, in the new ILAC, the Caribbean agreed to focus on 7. And they were very specific. Disaster risk reduction, that is rather obvious, right? Land use planning, these are countries with very little land and lots of needs. Watershed management, very sensible topic, because their sources of fresh water are limited. The care for protected areas, management of waste, production of energy, and finally governance. And these are the 7 topics that the Caribbean is currently focusing on in the ILAC context. And this is what we're doing with them. The second step for making indicators are either choose or propose new indicators and then agree on the metadata. And this is a very long and very thorny process, because let's say what I said in the beginning, that the statisticians are very sensitive to the use of language, for instance. Well, they are also very good at what they do. They're very technical people. And it's very hard for them to agree on metadata, usually because when you agree on metadata, you have to sacrifice a little bit of the precision of the indicator to allow for the possibility of measuring it. And this is something that these are very many conversations. Just to give you an example of what it means to produce metadata. We produced 26 different metadata with our focal points in the Latin America and the Caribbean. We did it on more than 100 meetings. So we had, in 1 year, we had more than 100 meetings, over 100 meetings with over 60 people in 10 different working groups. So this amounts for thousands of man-hours from experts in 20 countries. Each indicator required at least a few dozen, dozen hours, but if you multiply by the man-hours, it's a few hundred man-hours of work just to produce one single metadata. And what you're seeing, the screenshot that you're seeing on the right of your screen, is the first page of the metadata for one of our ILAC indicators. This was, in fact, an easy one because it's an SDG indicator. So what we did with this one is that we agreed that the SDG indicator was good, was possible to be measured in the region, and then we brought it into the ILAC indicator subset in the idea of having these multi-purpose indicators, right? And what we did here was just basically we translated the official SDG metadata into a metadata format, which is what you see here. Metadata is very, very organized a document that has all of the details of the indicator and how to measure it, what it's good for, how it should be interpreted, how it should not be interpreted, what are the limitations of the indicator, what it can be used for, etc., etc. We didn't just sit around and choose the indicators. We first defined criteria for the indicators, and they had to be relevant. They had to be relevant for the region and the ILAC initiative. they had to be computable, because if you remember that big circle that I showed you a few slides ago, we wanted the countries to actually report on these indicators, but we also had to make them flexible, because, well, not the case of the SDG indicators that we're using, but yes, it's the case of the ILAC indicators we're using. You have countries which are huge, like Brazil, the 5th biggest country in the world. And you have countries that are tiny, like St. Lucia, that can be engulfed inside of a hurricane. They're very, very small. And these two countries, of course, they have very different capacities. They have different priorities, and they just have different resources to gather the information, process it, and then report it. So we had to come up with ways of making these indicators flexible enough so that everyone could measure them and report them in more or less the same way, so that we could compare them later. And here I would like to make a small note, because sometimes in science, and I am, I've done quite a bit of research myself. So sometimes when we're focusing on science, we want things to be like perfectly comparable. So we want to use the exact same method for measuring things in 2 different places and so on. And the truth of the matter is that when it comes down to environmental indicators, and this is something I had to crack my own head with for a while until I finally got it. When we're talking with governments and their environmental indicators, and we want to compare between countries, there will always be differences, always. Because let's say in Argentina, the data is gathered with one type of equipment, and in Peru, it's gathered with another type of equipment, and perhaps in Bolivia, if it's not gathered with equipment at all, it's done by hand or observation, because we don't have the same exact setup for the experiments in each country. So what the metadata does, what we have done in the new version of the ILAC indicators metadata, is that we have what you're seeing on the screen, which is the general description of the indicator, and that's the way that everyone should be measuring it. But we also have a few pages after the first one, we have a place where countries can put all of their idiosyncrasies. So they can put all of the national details on how they're calculating things, so that when we make the comparisons of the data as UN Environment, as a decentralized organization, we can actually see, we know what the differences are in the process. And that allows us to make better interpretation of the comparisons, or sometimes not even compare at all. So that point of flexibility, I think, is really, really interesting for anyone, and especially for scientists that are looking forward to working with governments in the production of environmental information. Well, and finally, the metadata, this document should always be clear and complete. So anyone who reads the metadata should be able to understand the document, and it should have all of its fields completed. And what happens sometimes is that metadata gets written for an indicator and some things are missing. In the old ILAC, and in fact, many indicators from countries, they don't even have the calculation method. So they sort of describe it, but they don't have the equation well set, or they don't include the units that should be used for each of the variables in the equation, and so on. So those are very important details. One more detail, one more tip perhaps for talking to statisticians and people from the government, is that there are rules for making indicators. And that is it's a really fascinating field. And many times when I was doing research before knowing all of this, I would just make any index, right? And I would just accommodate it to the data that I had. But there's some funny rules for making indicators. And for instance, one of them is that when the value goes up, when the indicator value increases, the indicator should show a better situation. And not all indicators are built around this rule, but they should. And it really helps when you come down to interpretation. So it all sorts of comes together. When you have indicators that when they increase, they show a worse value, and you have a very time-limited decision maker that looks at the data, that looks at this particular graph, he or she will say, oh, it's going up, that's good. It's sort of a natural thing. If it's going up and to the right, normally we think it's sort of increasing, and that's good for some reason. So when expressing the data, it's really important to think, how is the other person going to see this thing? And perhaps it's better to switch the way that you build the indicator, the calculation method for the indicator, in the beginning, in the methodology, so that it is easier to report in the end. It's easier for the decision maker to understand it. And this decision maker doesn't need to be a minister. It can be let's say it could be a reporter from a newspaper. It could be someone doing citizen science. It could be anyone. The best is to have the indicator in the clearest way possible, so that there's no mistake, so that everyone can interpret it in the same way. Well, Frank asked me to make a point in where could research come in. So the whole point of this presentation is hopefully bringing all of you most of scientists to work with the government in the production of environmental information, so that we can have better regions, so that we can take care of the environment better. And there's a lot of data in the academia, and governments are usually not aware of it. So how can research come in? Well, normally when we start writing a paper, right, we write the part of the introduction, which is probably what all of our students hate to do, because they have to read a lot and summarize a lot. But that is a perfect example of what should be done in the beginning when working with indicators. So and it's also what we did with the ILAC. First, it's a good idea to understand what is already there. Sometimes there are indicators that are already in use in governments that could be very useful for your own research. And using the same indicators will increase the likelihood that your data gets to be used and understood by the government officials, because it's already in a format that they are familiar with. So that's the first point. Then, how could research help or provide environmental information? Well, normally by discovering new trends and identifying new threats. I am very happy to be here today, this morning, because I get to talk to the people who are at the edge of discovery. And you're right there. And sometimes what I've seen is that, and it happened to be, I just saw it a couple months ago in a conference. There's someone that has a very interesting piece of information. So whatever it is, let's say that you discovered that there's this particular little fish that can work as a wonderful indicator for the health of the oceans, whatever that organism is, and you have a very simple method to track it. So you publish, go to a conference, and that's fantastic. But the only problem is that, well, not a problem, but wouldn't it be just wonderful if, as well as presenting in a conference, you would perhaps request a meeting with the government officials, the people that are working in, let's say, the Ministry of the Environment, and you go and deliver a presentation for them and communicate these new trends or perhaps the new threats that you have found. These people, as I said in the beginning, and I always go back to the beginning of my presentation just to really give you a feeling of what it's like. They are very technical, they're very learned. Some of them were scientists before, but it's just the volume of things that they have to do every day is so large that sometimes that they don't know the basic things. They don't know that one particular piece of data that they want or need is already being calculated and is available online for free, for instance. So sometimes just running that extra mile and going over, connecting with these government officials will make your research more known, and it will open up new avenues of discovery, of perhaps partnering up with them, getting into new research that will have an impact on policymaking. Something else that can be done by researchers is to make the topic a national priority. And with the advent, of course, of social media, this is so much easier now. If you, I've seen many videos lately that show researchers explaining their findings in very layman language, and it really resonates with the audience. So there's not only the government, but society at large is interested in knowing what you know, and perhaps using social media and just socializing your findings more could make this topic a national priority. For instance, something that is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean now is this whole, well, and in the world at large, in fact, it's this fight against plastics, and specifically against marine litter. Why marine litter? Why not, let's say, dead zones? Why not? Marine litter gets more attention than climate change. It's amazing. This has become a world priority to stop marine litter, because there were groups that were very effective at communicating these pictures of beautiful turtles eating up plastic, and that resonated with everyone, with the decision makers and with society as well. And the thing is that sometimes when we divide society into, let's say, academia, the private sector, the public sector, and society, we sort of put ourselves in boxes that separate us unnecessarily. And the fact is that we're all people and we resonate with the same things. So if you think that something is amazing and is interesting, there's a very big chance that there will be a lot of other people that will think the same thing. It's just a matter of getting your knowledge out there in a format that is easier to understand for others, which are not, of course, as deep into the research as you are. One other thing that can be done by academia, by researchers, etc., is to lend scientific support in developing metadata. So I showed you before metadata, and there's a lot of very technical discussion going on with that. The way that you can participate in developing metadata is by first being in touch, connecting with your government officials. Once you know them and they know you, what normally happens is that they will invite you over to discuss or to consult this technical topics when they know what you do, whether they're dealing with a topic that is in your field of expertise. Another way of doing that is generally not so well known is to participate in the technical committees of the standards of organization of wherever you are. So there's usually a national standards institute or a national standards organization that deals with all of the national standards, of course. And normally this very same organization also deals with the ISO standards, which are increasingly technical. So that's two avenues of participation in the production of metadata. You can go, or methodologies, right? You can go and participate in an ISO committee, and you can also participate on a national standards organization committee, technical committee, where you can participate in the production of methodologies and metadata. Of course, well, I've covered, right, making measurements in indicators and communicate them to the government. For instance, let's say that you have an undergrad student and you want to update an indicator that your government usually updates every 5 years. You want to do it right in the middle of the period. So you have done your research, so you know what indicator is there and what the metadata is, and all of this metadata are normally public, so they're not so hard to find. And you get your students or to calculate this in the middle of the period. Well, that is a perfect opportunity to go on to point number 4 here on the slide, and perhaps going after the student has finished the thesis, going to the government officials and presenting the results. And that's a way to form a relationship. If you're in the statistics arena, well, teaching how to use and interpreting indicators correctly, that is huge help. We will never have enough statisticians in the world to do the wonderful job they do. And it's, if you have the knowledge, just sharing it with the government officials or with other people who are users of information already helps a lot. So there's many ways. I hope that I've given you a few ideas that you hadn't had already about how can research collaborate with governments in the production of environmental indicators. And I just wanted to give you an example of a declaration and an initiative that stemmed from academia and that is already getting up to the higher levels of decision makers. The Medellin Declaration was a declaration on marine litter that was written in Medellin, Colombia last year, 2017. And it has grown rather large and has made it all the way up to the G8 meeting. So there's a statement from the Medellin Declaration that will be read to the G8 participants on the topic of marine litter. So it was taken up by the Sherpas and it will go all the way into the meeting. And this is something that stemmed absolutely, it stemmed in an academic conference on life cycle assessment by researchers. And in a few months, let's say it's been a year and 3 months or 4 months ever since it was written, it has made it all the way up to the highest levels of political decision making in the world. So this is something that can happen very quickly. Perhaps other opportunities for collaboration are developing an indicator for a voluntary certification, or working with industry standards instead of working with government standards. So there are many industry standards related to sustainability. I can't remember the name right now of the one on oceans, but there is a standard on the sustainability of fisheries going around, and perhaps as a researcher or as an expert in the field, you could collaborate with these NGOs or organizations that make up the standards, that produce these standards, for making them more robust. Perhaps if you are, let's say that you're working on an international project, so you don't really want to engage with a government, you could look for regional projects like CLME Plus, which is the Caribbean large marine ecosystem. Actually, it's Caribbean and North Brazil Shale large marine ecosystem that covers a number of governments, and they already do the talking with all of the governments, but you can relate directly to the project and help them produce environmental indicators. You could also develop an indicator for a specific convention or a protocol. So if we remember the way that that climate change or that the hole on the ozone layer started, it was because researchers discovered that there was that the ozone layer was getting thinner because they measured some gases in the air, and that eventually became the key indicator for the most successful international agreement in the history of humankind. So this is really powerful. What you do can be very, very powerful if it's taken and if it's communicated to the right audiences. And as I was telling you before, participating in the production of national and international standards, like with your national standardization offices and ISOs. So I hope that I have shed some light and hopefully a few useful tips on how to work with government teams on the production of environmental indicators. That is, I hope that you leave with the idea that this is in fact a very long process and rather complicated. I didn't go into all of the details. I wanted to focus on the ideas I had for you. But I hope that you leave with that idea, and finally that you join the conversation and help governments and the world at large have a stronger environment. So with that, I would like to open up for questions.
Thank you, Pia. That was wonderful. And in fact, we do have quite a few minutes. We have about 20 minutes of time for questions or conversation. So I open the floor.
Hello.
Hello, Isabel.
Hello.
Hi, Isabel.
Hi, my name is Isabel Sosa Pinto. And actually, we were asked to help in the preparation of a forum for the CBD COP now in Egypt. And one of the questions is, how can science help in setting, I think several groups are working on this, setting up better post-2020 goals and targets and all this. I guess this has to do with what you're presenting, but you presented a very, this is the right way, but this is a very long way. Is there any fast track that we can use sometimes? I mean, now, to help this discussion, how can these post-2020 targets not be just a question of negotiation between a political negotiation, but also how can we get science to really give a contribution at this stage that is already quite close to the times where these decisions are going to have to be taken?
Yes, absolutely. And Isabel, I just want to start by saying that fortunately, the world is moving in the right direction, in the direction of science. And ever more governments are taking up scientific information to make decisions and to inform their decisions. Ultimately, all of the decisions made will have a political discussion, but hopefully we can make them discuss on the terms of science, right? So that no one can deny the actual facts. So you asked me how whether there's a fast track to setting up better post-2020 goals. And the fact is that perhaps we should move on to so let me show you the slide. How do I do this? Okay, let's just do it like this. Okay, so here we are. Well, what you are doing right now is to identify priorities. So you're on the gray square here, where you actually identify the goals. What I understand from your question is that you want to define things like what is the proportion of protected areas that there should be in each country? Is it 20% or 25%? Is it that thing? Or is it, should we be?
Also, is that, well, maybe we should not question that this is a priority, but even priorities, what are our highest priorities to really move towards, conservation and sustainable use? Could be also other things, of course, besides protected areas. Yeah, okay, but I think this is what I mean for the moment. We still are in that stage that we need to find, what should be in the goals.
That's great, and I think that if you want to define what should be in the goals, I think the best way to do that is to look at the science. What I'm I always work with a systemic perspective, so bear with me.
Okay,
So
sure.
if we have a system, right? There are some places in the system and where you will have a hub. So if you sort of put pressure down that particular element of the system, you will get a great alteration of all of the other elements. One example of this was the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone Park.
Yeah.
This is a pretty known case, right? Where you could, with one species, you managed to change the whole equilibrium of this huge ecosystem. And perhaps because you're sitting on the science table, if it would be exciting to see a priority set on these hotspots. What can we, because you have to bear in mind that there cannot be many priorities. So you need to choose them very wisely so that people cannot discuss them a lot. So it's a matter of being very, very strategic. So I would go for that. I would go for the hotspots in the system, or the hubs in the system.
So Pia and Isabel, Pia, at the beginning you mentioned that you were talking about the process for national indicators, but that there's also a parallel process for central production of indicators. For example, with aggregated data sets or remote sensing data sets or data that may be produced by the Global Ocean Observing System, for example, or OBIS or GBIF. And
okay, yeah.
so you said that, so who's in charge of vetting and setting the priorities, reviewing them, and then moving them forward? And in particular, in your sphere at the UN environment, and what type of indicators are you dealing with primarily at that level?
Okay, so I will go step by step here. Who defines the priorities? The priorities were defined by countries, and they were defined by consensus. So we had many priorities. We shortlisted them, and from that shortlist, we found consensus on what the priorities were for the entire region. So this is a collaborative process, and the best you can hope for is having as many people as possible participating on the identification of priorities. Once the priorities were set, we defined a few principles, let's say, to choose the indicators. And those principles were that everyone could measure them, that everyone could report them, that they were flexible, and so on and so forth, and that they were relevant for the countries. And normally we were a little bit, let's say, capped by the criteria of making them relevant and computable by countries because of the different capacities that every country has. So we ended up with a list of rather simple indicators. We have very complex indicators like the proportion of bodies of water that have good ambient water quality. That is a very complex indicator, but we also have very simple ones like what is the proportion of your territory that is protected areas. And you wanted me to make a point on the use of internationally produced information. That we are really striving to communicate the existence of this information to countries. So at some point in my presentation, I told you that these people are very, very busy. And although they're very interested on this particular type of tools, they don't really have the time to sit down and explore and read about them. And many times they don't know that they exist. So one of the things that we are doing is that we are organizing an event with many scientists in Ecuador for next month, where we will gather our focal points with the scientists and sort of make them an update on all of this technology, everything that's exciting that's going on in science related to the indicators, so that they know that there's new technology, that these things are rather cheap to make, they're cheaper than their current processes, that they're still as precise or robust, and making the point for a change in the technology and the processes that they're using. Because why are we doing this? Not because they're stupid. It's not because they don't want to do this. It's because it's really hard to change the way that things are done in organizations. And I'm sure that you can relate to this if you want to change anything in the universities where you work. It's like, oh no, we have been doing this for the last 20 years in this way, and everyone's used to that, and we already have the budget for that. So how are we going to change the way we do stuff? And it's no different in governments. So what we're going to try to do is like to make the point that there's all of these new possibilities out there, and that they're ready to be used by governments. However, there is a point that I wanted to make about centrally produced information, and that is that if you remember at some point I said that every country has like these little differences in the way that they produce indicators, and these little differences stem many times, of course, because of technical issues in the process of the production, but also sometimes they stem on, let's say, more of a political reason, let's say, because the country wants to show progress, but sometimes they won't have not the progress, but I'll give you an example. So Uruguay, for instance, they don't really have forests. They have large prairies. And one of the longest discussions that we had in our working groups was whether we should measure forest cover or we should measure like natural vegetation cover. And the whole point of choosing from one indicator to the next was the fact that Uruguay couldn't measure forests because they don't have forests. The proportion of forests in the country is very low. However, that doesn't mean that they don't have natural vegetation. It's just that their ecosystem is made out of prairies, so they have long grasses. But it looks bad when you look at the indicator on forests, because it looks like a very small number on forests, not because they're cutting them down, but because they just don't have them naturally. So I don't know if you see like the detail here. No, and the thing is that because countries, just let me finish my point. Because countries measure things in different ways with these little details, when you measure things in a centralized way with the same methodology for everyone, what countries normally complain about is that there are numbers on international reports talking about their country that they didn't produce, that they didn't approve of. And this is a problem on control, right? So the numbers that you get on the reports from the World Bank normally are not the same as the numbers that you get in the national reports. And this is a source of discrepancy and confusion for decision makers, for the community, for journalists in newspapers, because you get different numbers everywhere. So who do you trust, right? So this is why it's so important, and I always insist so much in doing the hard work and the long process of going country by country and really engaging in a conversation with the experts from the countries, so that when you release your numbers, they will be informed of them and they will not be against them or anything, or have any discrepancy with it. They will be informed of it. So it's a process of building a relationship, actually.
Oh, that's a very interesting and very important point. Anybody?
Sorry, I am so thorough. It's like I know I go a lot into the details, but I just really want to give you as much information as I can so that you understand like the nitty-gritty details of life in government.
Any other questions? If there are no other questions, then I think that we can close the call. We can thank Pia very much for the talk, and I know Pia is available to any of us as we move forward with MBON and trying to set priorities for indicators and organizing the community for best practices on collecting data and developing these important indicators. So last time, any questions? Okay, Pia, thank you so much again for being available for our conversation, and I know we will be talking more in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having me here and staying for the entire hour. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
And I will close the recording, but I will post the recording at the GeoBon website. So I will send an email out as I announce the next webinar. I will have the link for these recordings. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.